Hello, I am Patrick Shimori, and I want to take some more time to tell you about how I came to be incarcerated. I've spoke about the fact that I was and how that sort of started. But nothing really happens in a vacuum, and it's always interesting to see the layers of cause and effect that cause or allow certain things to happen in life. And it's a challenge to sort of explain how this it was kind of brought to my attention by the investigator for my defense. I was represented by a public defender appointed to me by the court, and actually one of the most compassionate people that was involved in the process who were helping me seemed to be the investigator who was trying to figure out how these things came to pass. And I was speaking to him in the lawyer conference room within the county jail that I was being housed in. And he had gathered the events and people and things that had happened and put them into a timeline. And he was looking at them all, and we were talking about it together. And he simply said that he's like, Mr. Shimori, it just seems like this was the perfect storm of things that came together to allow this to happen. And I have to agree with him. There were so many people and events and my own personal character flaws and fears that all had to come together in this strange symphony of my self-destruction. So to say where exactly it started or how it started is rather difficult, but because there's just so much that you decide whether to leave out or include. And so this won't touch on everything that was part of allowing these things to happen, but it helps me to say them. This is sort of a self-serving endeavor here to explain myself, because I think that one of my longest fears, and maybe fears of others as well, is just simply the fear of being misunderstood or thought to be something that you're not. And so, as much as this might be for you or for somebody else, it's for me. So we'll start at some beginning. It's not the very beginning, but it really started with my time in the Air Force. And I joined the Air Force in 2001 to be an air traffic controller. I was shortly out of high school. I'd been out of high school for a year, and I didn't really see a life trajectory that was going to serve me arising from my life in Tri-Cities, Washington. It's kind of like Richland and Pasco, for those of you who don't know where that is or what it is. It's in the kind of the it's in the southern part of Washington and in the western third. So that's where I grew up and decided that I needed to get out of there if I was going to start a life that I would ultimately want to live. And so I joined the Air Force, and I was supposed to join it with a friend, and we were going to go to basic training together and become air traffic controllers together. And then he decided it would be more fun to stay home and have a girlfriend and smoke pot. So he never came, but I did go. And so I joined the Air Force and went through the basic training and went to tech school, and I did really well in the air traffic control tech school. But then once I got to my duty station it's Langley Air Force Base, Hampton Roads, Virginia. once I got there, I found that I was not suitable for air traffic control. My mind, um, pretty smart guy. However, I just didn't have these basic types of skills that make a good air traffic controller. One, I'm not great at multitasking. So, if you can imagine, air traffic control is a never ending juggling act of multitasking, and they call it having the picture. And I could not keep the picture in my head. And so it was hard for me to maintain the idea of where all these different airplanes were and where they wanted to go and what they wanted to do. And on top of that, I have a skosh of dyslexia, enough to where a series of numbers and letters just don't really jive in my head. They don't stay where they're supposed to, and everything turns into alphabet soup. And it turns out that all the airplanes, their names are basically just letters and numbers, you know. So that didn't work out very well for me. So eventually I was asked to no longer try to be an air traffic controller. And that was a really saddening experience for me because my first effort to jump out into the world and become something didn't wind up how I wanted it to. And then I was faced with challenges in my retraining. I was depressed and wound up drinking beer a bunch and just not really doing a whole lot. And I put on weight enough to where I was considered overweight, which made it difficult for me to retrain. And that just caused more depression. And then the administration that was responsible for helping with the retraining wasn't always that helpful. And so I just kind of languished in this in-between place waiting for retraining. And also just never really felt at place within the military. It might have been a different experience had I joined the Navy or the Marines or whatnot, but I just didn't feel the military brotherhood in the Air Force. And so I often felt isolated and alone, and that I didn't have people around me who really reflected who I was. And over time, I wound up associating with people who were not supportive of me and didn't reflect my light. And they're good people. I believe they all have good hearts and good people, and there's not one of them that I wouldn't be happy to see again. But I also recognize now that these people did not support my greater good. And so I fell into this poor associations, and one of the things that we had in common is we like to drink beer and play video games and just kind of be losery is really what it was. And that effect caused me to be depressed and to feel like I was going nowhere and that my personal value was quite low. And I also wasn't doing great with, finding women to date and those kinds of things. But there had been this young woman in my age that I'd seen her before around the military base, and she was beautiful and shining and attractive, and I thought she was just a person of interest. And one day, perchance, she was cruising through the parking lot on the way to the gym, and I was helping my friend work on his vehicle, and she asked to bum a cigarette. And we obliged. Surely a couple of young men would do whatever to keep a pretty young woman around. And so we smoked cigarettes and we talked, and then invited her to come hang out and drink beers with us, and she was hip to that. And her name is Starla, and that's how we initially met. And so we hung out, and her and I became, first it was just really good platonic friends. We would laugh together and intrigued each other and joked and just had a pretty good time. And then our platonic relationship became romantic, and I found hope in her. If this person that I really wanted to be around me too, and she seemed to check a whole lot of boxes. She's driven and interesting and funny and pretty, and so I was really glad to have her around. And it was such a nice anecdote to this feeling of loneliness and valuelessness that I had been experiencing while I was in my pre-incarceration, or while I was in the Air Force. And so we wound up having to go and really make our thing work really fast because she was just getting out of the Air Force and she was fixing to move away. And she'd saved up a little bit of money to get her new start going. But that meant for us to work, we'd have to find ways of getting together. And so we did what a lot of young GIs do, which is that they do the hurry up and get married thing, just simply because it increases your benefit package through the military. And so, like for me, I couldn't move off the base unless I got married. And so once I was married, then I got a housing allowance and I got a substance allowance for groceries. And so then we could afford to be together. And that was very, very rushed. I'm talking, it was less than 7 months before we were married, which is a exceptionally short time. I mean, how can two people know each other in that time, especially two young people? You know, when you're in your early 20s, you're still settling into who you really are. And I don't think either one of us really knew who we were yet, but we were willing to try to figure that out together. And she was a person who had more vision for my future and who I was than I did at that time. And so she sort of inadvertently started to change me and to act on me. And it started with small things, you know, the types of clothes that I wore. You know, I was happy to wear some jeans and a t-shirt, and you know, all of a sudden I was wearing skinny jeans and fancy button-up shirts and shoes that I normally would never wear, and all of that stuff because that pleased her. And since I didn't really have a plan anyway, that seemed fine. And then it extended to other things like I'd always been called Pat, and to this day I still like to be called Pat, except if I'm trying to alpha up on some guy I think is tough, I'll tell him to call me Patrick. But to all my friends and family and general relationships, I'm Pat, and I'm okay with that. But the androgynousness of that name, she didn't like that, and so she insisted that I go by Patrick from there on out, and I didn't really like it, but it didn't seem like that big of a deal. Then she, you know, commenced with keeping me from hanging out with people that I used to like to hang out with. You know, some of my longtime friends like Dan Whitlock, she basically said that I couldn't hang out with him anymore. And somehow that made sense too. She resisted me taking trips home to go see my family or spend time with them. And when we did finally go to the Tri-Cities for my brother's 21st birthday, she really found ways to just make it all about her and not about me and spending time with my family. And she burst into rage and anger over not being the center of attention and really just kind of was being a big butt. And so it strained my relationships with my friends and my family to the point where she became the center of my world, which I think is really what ultimately, at some unconscious level, that she wanted. She saw something in me that she didn't have in herself and wanted that light all to her own. And that's just a story I'm making up. That might not be really happened, but that's how I remember it. And so we eventually left Hampton Roads after her father died unexpectedly in a workplace accident that was really truly tragic, and I was there for her in her grief and her grieving process, and we had the opportunity to move anywhere we wanted in the country after I got out of the Air Force, and we chose to move to Charlottesville, Virginia, so that she wouldn't be too far from her remaining family in Lynchburg, Virginia, which is only about an hour and a half away, which is a good arm's length distance to keep your in-laws, but still enough to where you can go see them on the weekend and appreciate them. And I really did appreciate all of my in-laws, my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, and nieces and nephews, and new grandpas and new grandmas, and it was all, I loved that. So we started a new life in Charlottesville, and she helped me to become a realtor. She supported me while I was cultivating my realtor practice, and I got to where I was pretty good at that. And meanwhile, it stayed largely the same, where I could have friends that she approved of, and I wasn't having friends that she didn't approve of, and still I was trying to make sense of my own life. And I turned to spirituality through one of my realtor friends. We were partners, and I truly appreciate and miss that woman still to this day. She introduced me to spiritual concepts that I hadn't really heard of, and practices like with Abraham Hicks and the art of allowing, which is this simple practice, simple, not easy, of recognizing that the universe will bring to you those things which you are attracting to you and attuned with. And so I started that practice, and my life started to change really rapidly, and at first for the best. My real estate practice started to soar. This was back in 2007 and 8 when the real estate market was downtrending, but my numbers were kept going up and staying steady to the point where the senior realtors were coming to me and asking me, "How are you doing this?" And I said, "Well, it's this thing. It's this art of allowing, this law of attraction." And so as I was growing in this, I felt that that I had a good foundation, but little did I know that I really didn't. Because to me, it's still, at some level, it was just about sort of getting the stuff and about becoming a more potent and powerful kind of a person. And I didn't understand really what I was messing with. And it wasn't until later that I really saw that I was able to attract and allow my own downfall. And so as kind of times went on, it was getting towards 2008, and her and I were both having these really interesting and amazing sort of awakening experiences, is what I would call it, that we were suddenly seeing the world in new potentials and new ways, and it was exciting to us, and I felt a sense of being powerful in a world where I had never really exercised personal power before. And as I did that, I sort of was shining my light to others. And the story I tell myself is that in my shining my light onto others, it started to make her insecure. And while she was on this path as well, she was really kind of aggressive in it in a way that I didn't really understand. And I just sort of felt it was something she was going to pass through. But she would try to, just like, I remember her cornering a friend in the kitchen and in a raised voice telling this person about the joys of spiritual life, basically trying to use anger and force to get somebody to see the world in a different way. Which was sort of funny because she grew up in a town in Lynchburg, where Liberty University is, the home of Jerry Falwell, the Christian evangelicalist, and she never liked that guy, and she was strongly opposed to Christianity, but she was using aggressive methods of proselytizing to other people. Kind of found that ironic, but I tried to remind her of it, but didn't really go too far. And as we progressed, she seemed to just get a little more and more unstable, to the point where she would often have negative encounters with people, asserting her truths on them and not listening to others, and trying to awaken people that were content sleeping. And you just can't force awakening on others. And so this continued until eventually she spontaneously quit her job as a lab technician at the University of Virginia, where she was a very valued and effective employee, and she's great at what she does. And maybe she's still doing that today, and I know right now with the COVID thing, they definitely need laboratory workers doing the lab stuff. So I hope that she's has re-encountered and re-engaged those skills and is using those to benefit others. But she quit her job, and some way I told myself that was all right, because she'd supported me as I was creating my realtor business, and I felt it was fair for her to take some time and get herself together and go through this metamorphosis that she was going through, and that I could take care of her. And her metamorphosis was very challenging and very aggressive, and she would break down and cry, and I remember how sort of desperately she really wanted real human contact and for others to feel what she felt. But it just doesn't work that way always. And then it came around to, it was February, and it was the day after, it was actually Mardi Gras was happening, that she came to me and said, "Hey, let's go to New Orleans." And I had a lot of real estate stuff going on and all of that, and I thought about it for a little bit and decided maybe that would be good. I wanted to help her get to the bottom of whatever things that she was addressing, and in a way that our relationship maybe needed an adventure and something fun and exciting and different. And so I agreed to head to New Orleans with her. And so we dropped everything and started making plans to go do that. And I'm going to leave the New Orleans trip for the next episode, because that's when things sort of really got out of hand and complicated, and the course of my falling and self-destruction